Some mistakes stay with you forever. For 58-year-old cowboy Boone Travers, one decision has haunted him for nearly 30 years. On the edge of a dying frontier town, Boone finds a worn wallet in the dirt. His donkey Clementine stops beside him, sensing something important. Inside is an old photograph of a young girl with his mother's handwriting on the back. The name stops his heart. Lila, his daughter, the child he gave up for adoption decades ago. What Boone discovers will send him across forgotten towns and through buried memories. Searching for answers he's not sure he can face. Will the truth finally bring him peace, or tear open wounds that never healed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun hung low over Redemption Springs, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. The town wore its age like a weathered face, every building and boardwalk telling stories of better days. Once this place had been alive with miners and ranchers, with the sound of hammers and commerce. Now only a handful of businesses remained: the Dusty Rose Saloon, Clara's General Store, and the old feed supply that opened maybe twice a week. Boone Travers knew every crack in these sidewalks, every faded sign and boarded window. He'd lived on the outskirts of Redemption Springs for 20 years now, long enough to become part of the landscape himself. At 58, he carried his years in the lines around his eyes and the silver threading through his dark hair. His hands were calloused from decades of ranch work, his back slightly stooped from too many hours bent over fence posts and hay bales. He wasn't a large man, never had been, but there was a solid quality to him, like old leather or weathered wood. His eyes, when they weren't hidden beneath the brim of his worn hat, were a deep brown that held both kindness and regret in equal measure. People in town knew him as quiet, reliable, the kind of man who showed up when he said he would and did what he promised. They also knew him as solitary, keeping mostly to himself, except for the necessary interactions of small-town life. The only constant companion in Boone's life was Clementine, a grey donkey with soulful eyes and a stubborn streak that matched his own. He'd found her 12 years ago, wandering loose on a back road, ribs showing through her coat. No one claimed her, so Boone took her home and nursed her back to health. She'd been with him ever since, more friend than beast of burden. Clementine had a way of understanding him that most people didn't, stopping when he needed to rest, nuzzling his shoulder when the weight of the past grew heavy on him. Today had been like most others. Boone had spent the morning mending fence for the Morrison Ranch, 5 miles out of town. The work was hard, but familiar, and he was grateful for it. At his age, steady work wasn't guaranteed. The Morrisons paid fair and didn't ask questions, which suited him fine. By afternoon, his back ached and his shirt was soaked with sweat, but the fence was solid and he had cash in his pocket. He rode Clementine back toward town, her hooves raising small clouds of dust on the dirt road. The landscape around Redemption Springs was harsh and beautiful in its own way. Scrub brush and red rock, distant mesas painted gold by the lowering sun. This was high desert country, where summer burned hot and winter bit cold, where only the stubborn and the resigned chose to stay. As they approached the edge of town, passing the Dusty Rose Saloon, Clementine suddenly stopped. Boone clicked his tongue, nudged her gently with his heels, but she wouldn't budge. She stood firm in the middle of the road, her ears forward, her attention fixed on something Boone couldn't yet see. "Come on, girl," he said, his voice carrying the patient weariness of long familiarity. "It's been a long day." But Clementine just looked at him, then back at the ground near the saloon's hitching post. Boone sighed and dismounted, his knees protesting slightly as his boots hit the dirt. He walked to where she was staring and saw it, a worn leather wallet, half buried in the dust, as if someone had dropped it and the wind had tried to claim it. Boone picked it up, brushing off the dirt. The leather was old, soft with age and use, the stitching frayed in places. He figured someone inside the saloon must have lost it. Tommy Red, the owner, would know what to do with it. But something made him open it first, maybe to find an ID, to know whose property he was returning. Inside was no money, no driver's license or credit cards. Just a few items, carefully preserved, an old tin-type photograph, a folded piece of paper, what looked like a pressed flower, and a yellow document. Boone pulled out the photograph first. The image showed a young girl, maybe 3 years old, with bright eyes and a small, uncertain smile. She wore a simple dress, and around her neck hung a locket he recognized immediately. It had belonged to his mother. His hands began to shake. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting he knew as well as his own, his mother had written, "Lila, age 3, 1997. The world seemed to tilt. Boone sank down onto the edge of the saloon's wooden porch, the wallet still clutched in his hands. Lila, his daughter. The child he'd given up for adoption 28 years ago, when he was 30 and too much of a coward to be a father. With trembling fingers, he examined the other contents. The pressed flower was an Indian paintbrush, Sarah's favorite. Sarah Meadows, Lila's mother, the woman he'd loved without knowing how to hold on to her. The yellow document was a copy of the adoption certificate, his signature stark and damning at the bottom. And the slip of paper held an address, 412 Elm Street, Silver Creek. Memories crashed over him like a wave. Sarah's face, young and hopeful. The day she told him she was pregnant, the fear that had seized him. The months of fumbling attempts at responsibility that only highlighted how unprepared he was. Then Sarah's death in that car accident when Lila was 3, and his complete collapse in the face of single parenthood. The decision, the terrible, cowardly decision, to give Lila up for adoption, to tell himself she'd be better off without him. His mother had been furious. "That's your child, Boone, your blood. You don't just walk away from that." But he had walked away. He'd signed the papers, watched, as the social worker carried 3-year-old Lila to the car, her small face confused and frightened. He'd told himself it was for the best. He'd told himself a lot of things over the years. Clementine moved closer, pressing her warm nose against his shoulder. Boone wrapped an arm around her neck, grateful for her solid presence. He didn't cry. He'd used up his tears long ago, or so he thought, but his chest felt hollow, like something had been carved out of him. How did this wallet get here? Had Lila been in Redemption Springs? Was she looking for him? The address in Silver Creek, did she live there? Was she nearby? The questions spun through his mind, each one more urgent than the last. He sat there for a long time, as the sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Around him, Redemption Springs went about its quiet business. A truck rattled past. Voices drifted from inside the saloon. Somewhere a dog barked. Life continued, indifferent to the fact that Boone's own life had just been turned upside down. Finally, as the first stars began to appear, he stood. His legs felt unsteady, but Clementine was there to lean against. He carefully placed all the items back in the wallet and tucked it inside his jacket, close to his heart. Then he climbed onto Clementine's back and guided her toward his cabin, a mile outside of town. The cabin was small and plain, one room with a wood stove, a narrow bed, a table, and 2 chairs. It suited a man who lived simply and asked for little. Boone lit the oil lamp and sat at the table, spreading the wallet's contents before him. He studied the photograph until he had memorized every detail, the shape of Lila's face, the way one small hand clutched at her dress, the serious expression in her eyes that seemed too old for 3 years. She would be 31 now. A grown woman. What did she look like? What kind of life had she built? Did she hate him? Did she even remember him? He'd held her as a baby, changed her diapers, sung her to sleep with old Cowboy songs his own father had taught him. But she'd only been 3 when he gave her away. Maybe he was nothing to her but a name on a document, a ghost of a father who'd chosen not to stay. Boone picked up the adoption certificate, reading it again though he knew what it said. The names of the adoptive parents, Robert and Margaret Thornton, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Good people, he'd been told, stable, ready to love a child. Everything he wasn't back then. Had they told Lila about him? Had they spoken kindly, or had they painted him as the coward he was? He couldn't blame them either way. The truth was the truth. The pressed wildflower was brittle with age, its color faded but still recognizable. Indian paintbrush. Sarah used to pick them by the armful, fill jars with them, declare them the most beautiful thing in all of creation. She'd been 27 when they met, working as a waitress in the next town over. He'd fallen for her smile first, then her laugh, then the way she saw good in everything, even in him. Their time together had been brief but intense. 6 months of something that felt like love, though Boone had been too young and stupid to recognize it fully. When Sarah got pregnant, he'd tried. He'd really tried. Got a steadier job, rented a small house, promised to do right by her. But fear lived in his chest, whispering that he'd fail, that he'd turn out like his own father, absent, disappointing, destructive. When Sarah died, that fear became reality. He'd looked at 3-year-old Lila and seen only his own inadequacy staring back. So he'd made the choice that had defined the rest of his life. The choice that turned him into the kind of man who lived alone in a cabin, with only a donkey for company. Boone carefully placed everything back in the wallet, except the photograph. That he propped against the oil lamp where he could see it. Then he sat back in his chair and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd lost, what he'd thrown away, what might impossibly be within reach again. Outside, Clementine settled in her small stable. A coyote called from somewhere in the hills. The night deepened around the cabin, vast and indifferent. And Boone Travers, 58 years old and full of regret, sat alone with the ghost of his daughter and wondered if some mistakes could ever be made right. Boone didn't sleep that night. He lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows shift as the moon moved across the sky. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lila's face in that photograph, saw Sarah's handwriting, saw his own signature on the adoption papers. By the time dawn broke, he felt hollowed out but strangely clear-headed, as if the sleepless night had burned away everything except what mattered most. He made coffee as the sun rose, strong and black, and sat on his porch with the wallet beside him. Clementine wandered over from her stable, and he fed her an apple from his dwindling supply, running his hand along her neck. "Found something yesterday, girl," he said quietly. "Something I never thought I'd see again." She regarded him with those knowing eyes, and he could swear she understood. Animals had a way of sensing when the world had shifted, when something fundamental had changed. Clementine pressed her head against his chest, and he took comfort in her warmth. Around 8 o'clock, Boone saw the dust trail of a vehicle approaching. He recognized Sheriff Marcus Webb's old truck before it pulled up in front of the cabin. Webb was 67 now, officially retired, but he still wore the badge and still kept an eye on Redemption Springs out of habit and love. He climbed out of the truck slowly, his joints protesting the morning chill, and walked up to the porch with the careful gait of a man who'd earned every one of his years. "Morning." "Boone," Webb said, his voice gravelly from a lifetime of cigarettes he'd finally quit 10 years back. "Saw you ride past the station yesterday evening. You looked like you'd seen a ghost." Boone gestured to the empty chair beside him. Webb sat, accepting the cup of coffee Boone poured from the pot he kept warm on the porch's small table. For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, two men who'd known each other long enough that words weren't always necessary. "I found something," Boone finally said. He pulled the wallet from his jacket pocket and handed it to Webb. The old sheriff examined the contents carefully, his weathered face growing more serious with each item. When he read the name on the back of the photograph, he looked up at Boone with an expression of deep understanding and something that might have been sorrow. "Your daughter," Webb said. "It wasn't a question." "Yeah," Boone's voice was rough. "I gave her up when she was 3, after Sarah died. I didn't know how to be a father." "This town don't forget, Boone," Webb said slowly, handing back the wallet. "But it forgives." Boone turned the wallet over in his hands. "How did it get here? Was she in town? Looking for me?" "Those are fair questions." Webb leaned back in his chair, thinking. "The address in Silver Creek, that's maybe 2 days' ride from here. You thinking of going?" "I don't know what I'm thinking." Boone set down his coffee cup. "What if she doesn't want to see me?" What if she hates me for what I did? What if she's been searching for you? Webb countered. What if that wallet didn't get lost by accident? What if she left it there, hoping you'd find it? The possibility hadn't occurred to Boone, but it settled in his chest like a stone, heavy but somehow anchoring. You think? I think sometimes the past comes back not to haunt us, but to heal us, Webb said. I think you've been carrying this guilt for near 30 years, and maybe it's time to set it down. Or at least try. They sat quiet for a while longer, watching the sun climb higher. Finally, Webb stood to leave. At his truck, he turned back. Boone, whatever you decide, you're not alone in this. This town, we're here. After Webb left, Boone knew what he had to do, but fear still gripped him. He needed one more perspective, one more voice to tip the balance. He saddled Clementine and rode into town, stopping at Clara's general store. Clara Jensen was 52, with kind eyes and capable hands. She'd run the store for 20 years, ever since her husband died. She knew everyone's business, not out of nosiness, but because people trusted her with their troubles. When Boone walked in, she was arranging canned goods on a shelf. She took one look at his face and gestured him to the back room where she kept a small office. Sit, she said, pointing to a worn armchair. You look like you've been dragged behind a horse. Boone sat and, without preamble, told her everything. Clara listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from surprise to sadness to something that looked like determination. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I knew Sarah. Boone looked up sharply. You did? She used to come in here when you two were together. Sweet girl, kind. She talked about you like you hung the moon even after. Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. Even after things went bad. When she died, I cried for days. And I cried for that little girl, losing her mama so young. I failed them both, Boone said, the words bitter in his mouth. You were young and scared, Clara said firmly. That don't excuse it, but it explains it. The question now isn't about what you did then. It's about what you're going to do now. What if she won't see me? What if I make things worse? Clara leaned forward, her eyes intense. Boone Travers, you've been running from this for 30 years. Maybe it's time to stop. That girl, that woman now, she kept these things. This photograph, this flower. People don't keep things from people they hate. They keep things from people they wonder about, people they might want to know. You really think so? I think you won't know unless you try. And I think you'll regret it for the rest of your life if you don't. She stood up, went to a drawer, and pulled out a faded envelope. Sarah gave me this right before she died. Said to give it to Lila if I ever met her. I never did. But maybe you will. Boone took the envelope with shaking hands. It was sealed, Sarah's handwriting on the front, for Lila when she's ready. Go to Silver Creek, Clara said gently. Find your daughter, and give her what her mama wanted her to have. Boone left the store with the envelope tucked safely in his jacket next to the wallet. He rode back to his cabin with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The fear was still there, it would probably always be there, but beneath it was something else. Hope, fragile and uncertain, but real. That afternoon, he prepared for the journey. He packed a saddlebag with essentials, dried meat, hardtack, a blanket, spare clothes. He groomed Clementine until her coat shone, checking her shoes, making sure she was ready for the long ride. He left a note for the Morrisons, explaining he'd be gone for a while, not sure when he'd return. As evening fell, Boone stood at the edge of his property, looking out at the path that would take him toward Silver Creek, toward Lila, toward whatever came next. Clementine stood beside him, patient and ready. I don't know what's waiting out there, girl, he said to her. Don't know if she'll even talk to me. But Clara's right. I've been running long enough. He thought about Sarah, about the envelope in his jacket. He thought about 3-year-old Lila, confused and frightened, being carried away. He thought about all the years he'd lost, all the moments he'd missed. He couldn't change any of it, but maybe, just maybe, he could start making up for it. As the last light faded from the sky, Boone made his decision. Tomorrow, at first light, he would begin the journey, not just to Silver Creek, but toward redemption, toward the daughter he'd abandoned. toward the man he should have been all along. He went inside, sat at his table, and looked one more time at the photograph. "I'm coming, Lila," he whispered to the image. "I don't know if you can forgive me, but I'm coming." Outside, the night settled over Redemption Springs. Inside, a 58-year-old cowboy who'd spent 30 years running finally stopped and turned to face his past. Dawn came cold and clear. Boone was already awake, had been for hours. He loaded his saddlebag onto Clementine, checked his supplies one last time, and locked the cabin door. The ride to Silver Creek would take 2 days if they kept a steady pace. Longer if they didn't. He had nowhere to be except where he was going. The first hours passed in silence, broken only by Clementine's hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. They followed old trails through high desert country, past rock formations that had stood for thousands of years, past dried creek beds that remembered water. The landscape had a stark beauty that Boone had always appreciated. Nothing soft or forgiving about it, but honest in its harshness. As they rode, memories surfaced unbidden. He remembered the county fair where he'd met Sarah 28 years ago. She'd been working a booth, selling homemade preserves, her face flushed from the heat, her laugh rising above the noise of the crowd. He'd bought a jar of peach jam he didn't want just to have an excuse to talk to her. Their courtship had been quick, intense. Within a month, they were inseparable. She made him feel like he could be better than he was, like the darkness he carried from his own childhood didn't have to define him. For a brief, shining moment, he'd believed her. Then came the news of the pregnancy. He could still remember the look on Sarah's face when she told him, hope and fear mixed together. He'd said all the right things at first, told her they'd figure it out, that he'd take care of her and the baby. And he'd meant it in that moment. But as the months passed and the reality set in, the old fears crept back. What if he failed? What if he turned out like his own father, who'd abandoned the family when Boone was 10? By the time Lila was born, Boone was already pulling away, working longer hours, finding excuses to be elsewhere. Sarah had carried the weight mostly alone, and she'd done it with grace he didn't deserve. Even after he'd essentially checked out emotionally, she'd tried to hold them together. Then the accident. A drunk driver, a rainy night, Sarah's car sliding off the road. She died on the way to the hospital. Boone had been left with a 3-year-old daughter he barely knew how to talk to, much less raise alone. He'd lasted 6 months before the weight crushed him. 6 months of failing at everything. Burning meals, forgetting to do laundry, watching helplessly as Lila cried herself to sleep. His mother had tried to help, but she was dealing with her own health problems. Finally, in a moment of what he'd told himself was selflessness, but knew was cowardice, he'd contacted an adoption agency. The memory of signing those papers still made his hands shake. The social worker had been kind but firm, explaining what would happen, what rights he was giving up. Lila had clung to him as they tried to take her, crying, "Daddy, Daddy," over and over. That word had haunted him ever since. Clementine's sudden stop pulled Boone from his thoughts. They'd reached a small spring, water trickling from between rocks into a natural pool. Time for rest. He dismounted, let Clementine drink, splashed cold water on his face. The sun was high now, the day warming. He ate some dried meat and hardtack, sharing bits with Clementine. A lizard watched them from a nearby rock, perfectly still. Boone found himself talking aloud, the way he often did when alone with the donkey. What if she won't even open the door? What if she tells me to leave and never come back? He looked at Clementine, who regarded him calmly. I deserve that. I know I do. But it'll still hurt like hell. They rested for an hour, then continued. The terrain gradually changed as they moved north. More vegetation, scattered juniper and pinyon trees, the land rising slightly. By late afternoon, Boone knew they wouldn't make Silver Creek before dark. He found a sheltered spot off the trail, set up camp as the sun painted the western sky orange and red. That night, wrapped in his blanket with a small fire crackling, Boone pulled out Sarah's envelope. He turned it over in his hands, tempted to open it, but knowing it wasn't his to read. Whatever Sarah wanted to tell Lila was between them. He was just the messenger 30 years late. Sleep came fitfully, full of dreams he couldn't quite remember when he woke. By first light, they were moving again. The second day's ride was quieter in Boone's mind, as if he'd exhausted his capacity for remembering and was left with only the present moment. Clementine's steady gait, the warming air, the gradual appearance of more civilization as they neared Silver Creek. They arrived in late afternoon. Silver Creek was larger than Redemption Springs, a real town with paved streets and traffic lights. Boone felt out of place immediately, this dusty cowboy on his donkey among cars and modern storefronts. But he had the address memorized, 412 Elm Street. He found it without difficulty, a small cottage with blue shutters, a neat yard, flowers in window boxes. His heart hammered as he approached. He tied Clementine to a fence post and walked up the path to the front door. His hand shook as he knocked. No answer. He waited, knocked again. Still nothing. She's not there. The voice came from the neighboring house. An elderly woman stood on her porch, watching him with open curiosity. Left about 3 months back. Boone turned to her, disappointment crushing his chest. "Do you know where she went?" The woman, she must have been in her 70s, came down off her porch and approached slowly. "Who's asking?" "My name's Boone Travers. He paused, the word foreign on his tongue but undeniable. "I'm her father." The woman's expression shifted from suspicion to surprise to something like recognition. "Her father? My goodness. She talked about looking for you. She did?" "Oh yes, Lila, sweet girl. Lived here about a year. She'd found some adoption records, was trying to trace you. Spent months at it." The woman extended her hand. "I'm Harriet Doyle. Lila and I got close. She'd come over for tea. Tell me about her search." Boone shook her hand, barely able to process what she was saying. Lila had been looking for him. While he'd been hiding in Redemption Springs, she'd been searching. "Do you know where she went?" he asked again, urgency in his voice. "Canyon Ridge, about a day's ride north of here. Got a job at a lumber mill. Said she needed a fresh start after—" Harriet paused. "She seemed sad, Mr. Travers, like she was carrying something heavy. Did she find me? Is that why she was sad?" "No, she hit dead ends. Someone told her you'd moved away from Redemption Springs years ago. She came back here heartbroken, said she'd never find you. The irony was painful. They'd been looking for each other, missing each other by a matter of timing and misinformation. Do you have an address?" "In Canyon Ridge?" Harriet nodded and went back to her house, returning with a slip of paper. "Above the hardware store on Main Street. Apartment 2B. She gave me her address in case any mail came." Boone took the paper with both hands, as if it were precious. "Thank you, Mrs. Doyle. Thank you so much, Mr. Travers." Harriet's voice stopped him as he turned to leave. "When you find her, be patient. She's been hurt before. But I think she still wants to find you. I think that's why she kept looking even when it seemed hopeless." Boone nodded, not trusting his voice. He returned to Clementine, showed her the address. "One more day, girl. One more day, and we'll find her." As they left Silver Creek behind, heading north toward Canyon Ridge, Boone felt the weight of near misses and lost time pressing on him. But underneath it was something else, the knowledge that Lila had been searching, that some part of her wanted to know him. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. And for now, that was enough to keep him moving forward. The road to Canyon Ridge wound through pine forests and alongside a river that ran cold and clear. Boone and Clementine made steady progress, though Boone's impatience grew with every mile. He was so close now. After 30 years and 3 days of travel, he was hours away from seeing his daughter. The thought terrified him. During a rest stop by the river, Boone examined the photograph again, studying details he'd missed before. Lila wore a small locket in the picture, a gold chain with an engraved pendant. He leaned closer, squinting at the image. The engraving was barely visible in the old photograph, but he recognized it instantly. Wildflowers, the same pattern as the locket his mother had given Sarah. The realization hit him with unexpected force. His mother had given that locket to Sarah just before she died, when Lila was still a baby. "This should stay with the child no matter what happens," she'd said. Sarah had honored that wish. Even after Boone abandoned them, even after everything fell apart, Sarah had made sure Lila kept that connection to her grandmother. It meant something, this preservation of family. It meant Sarah hadn't wanted to erase Boone from Lila's life, even when she had every right to. The thought brought both comfort and fresh pain. By late afternoon, Canyon Ridge appeared in the distance, a mountain town built on timber money, rougher around the edges than Silver Creek, more working class. Logging trucks rumbled through streets lined with equipment supply stores and diners with names like the Sawdust Cafe. Boone felt more comfortable here. Among working people and practical businesses, he found Main Street and the hardware store easily enough. Above it, a wooden staircase led to a second floor with 2 apartment doors. Boone climbed slowly, Clementine waiting below, each step feeling heavier than the last. At the top, he stood in front of 2B, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it. He raised his hand to knock, hesitated, then knocked anyway. 3 sharp raps. The door opened almost immediately, as if someone had been standing right behind it. But it wasn't Lila. It was a man, maybe 32 or 33, with the build of someone who worked with his hands and the sharp, protective eyes of someone who'd been hurt before. Yeah? The man's tone was neutral but guarded. "I'm looking for Lila Meadows," Boone said, his voice steadier than he felt. The man's expression hardened immediately. "Who's asking?" "My name is Boone Travers. I'm Herb." He paused, then said it. "I'm her father." The change in the man's face was instantaneous. His jaw tightened, his stance shifted subtly to block the doorway more completely. "Her father!" The words were flat, almost mocking. "You've got some nerve showing up here." Boone took a step back, hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. "I just need to talk to her, please." "She doesn't want to talk to you." The man's voice was hard now. "She made that pretty clear when she gave up looking. You're Jack." Boone wasn't asking, that's right. "And you're the man who gave her away when she was 3 years old. So forgive me if I'm not rolling out the welcome mat." Boone absorbed the anger, knew he deserved it. "I know what I did. I know I got no right to ask anything. But I found her wallet. In Redemption Springs. 2 weeks ago." Jack's expression shifted slightly. Surprise, maybe calculation. "Her wallet?" "Yeah." Boone pulled it from his jacket, held it up. "She lost it when she was there looking for me. I found it on the road outside the saloon. That's how I knew. That's why I came." Jack stared at the wallet, then back at Boone's face, as if trying to determine whether he was lying. Finally, he said, "She's been crying about that wallet. Thought she'd lost all those pictures and papers forever. I brought it back, and I need to give it to her. To talk to her." Boone kept his voice level, respectful. "Please. You know what she went through trying to find you?" Jack's voice rose slightly. She spent months tracking down records, making calls, following dead ends. She went to Redemption Springs scared out of her mind, worked up the courage to ask about you. And some idiot at the saloon told her you'd left years ago. She came back here destroyed. Took weeks before she'd even talk about it. The guilt settled heavier on Boone's shoulders. "Someone must have confused me with Jim Travers. He left town about 5 years back. I never left. I've been there 20 years. Jack studied him, and Boone could see the internal debate playing across his face. Protection versus fairness. Love versus justice. "Look," Boone said quietly, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm not here to demand anything. I just want to give her back what's hers and tell her I'm sorry. What she does with that, that's up to her." "You really found the wallet?" "You're not making that up?" "I really found it." Boone opened it, showed Jack the contents. "That's her mother's handwriting on the photo. And this," he pulled out Sarah's sealed envelope. "This is from her mother. For Lila, been waiting 30 years to be delivered." Jack's resistance cracked slightly at the sight of the envelope. He ran a hand through his hair, torn. "She's at work. The timber mill. Down on River Road, you can't miss it. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Jack's voice turned hard again. "If you hurt her, if you make this worse, I don't care how old you are or what kind of guilt you're carrying. You'll answer to me." "Understood." Boone met his eyes. "For what it's worth, I think she's lucky to have someone who protects her like you do. That's more than I ever gave her." Jack didn't respond, just watched as Boone descended the stairs. At the bottom, Clementine waited patiently. Boone untied her, ran his hand along her neck. "She's here, girl. She's really here. But we got one more stop." He followed Jack's directions to River Road, his stomach knotting tighter with each block. The timber mill sprawled along the river, massive and industrial. Stacks of cut lumber, the whine of saws, the smell of fresh pine thick in the air. A small office building sat at the front of the complex, and through its window Boone could see a figure working at a desk. He tied Clementine to a post, approached the door with leaden feet. Through the window he could see her more clearly now. Dark hair pulled back, bent over paperwork, one hand absently touching something at her throat. The locket. She still wore it. Boone stood at the threshold, one hand on the door handle, paralyzed by the enormity of the moment. 30 years had led to this. 30 years of regret, of running, of telling himself it was too late to make amends. And now, separated from his daughter by nothing but a door and a few feet of space, he found himself unable to move. Clementine's soft bray behind him broke the spell. He turned, saw her looking at him with those patient, knowing eyes. Right, he'd come this far. No sense stopping now. Boone took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to whatever might be listening, and pushed open the door. The woman at the desk looked up at the sound of the door, her expression polite but distracted, the way people look when interrupted from work. Then she saw Boone's face, and her expression changed completely. Shock, disbelief, recognition that couldn't be denied. She had Sarah's eyes, the same deep brown, the same intelligence and wariness mixed together, but her features were her own, or perhaps some combination of both parents that created something entirely new. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with physical features and everything to do with the strength that radiated from her, even in this moment of frozen surprise. "Can I help you?" The words came out automatically, her mind still catching up to what her eyes were seeing. Boone's throat was so tight he could barely speak. He stopped, started again. "My name is Boone Travers." The color drained from Lila's face. She stood up so fast, her chair rolled backward, hitting the wall behind her. "Get out!" The words hit him like a physical blow, but he didn't move, couldn't move. "Please, I said get out." Her voice shook with an emotion Boone couldn't quite name. Rage, pain, something deeper and more complicated than simple anger. He held up the wallet, hand trembling. "You dropped this in Redemption Springs." "I found it." Lila stared at the wallet, and for a moment every emotion played across her face in rapid succession. Surprise, confusion, longing, fury. She didn't reach for it. 2 weeks. "I was there 2 weeks ago. I know, I heard. I never left town, Lila. I've been there 20 years. Someone gave you wrong information. 20 years. She repeated the words like they were in a foreign language. "I was there. I asked about you. They said you were gone. Jim Travers left, not me. I stayed." Boone took a careful step forward, set the wallet on the edge of her desk. "I found this 3 days ago. Been riding since to get here." Lila's hands gripped the edge of her desk so hard her knuckles went white. "Why? Why now, after all this time?" "Because I didn't know you were looking for me. When I saw what was in that wallet, when I realized you'd been to Redemption Springs trying to find me," his voice broke. "I had to come. You had to." Her laugh was bitter. "You didn't have to 30 years ago when I was 3 years old and crying for my daddy. You didn't have to when you signed those papers and gave me away like I was nothing." "You're right." Boone didn't try to defend himself. "You're absolutely right about all of it." The admission seemed to take some of the wind from her anger. She sank back into her chair, but her body remained rigid, defensive. Other office workers had stopped what they were doing, watching the scene unfold. Lila noticed, her face flushing. "Outside," she said, standing again and grabbing her jacket. "Not here." Boone followed her out of the office, through the lumberyard to a quiet spot behind stacks of fresh-cut timber. The smell of pine was overwhelming here, the sound of saws, distant but constant. Lila stood with her arms crossed, her back against a stack of wood, maintaining distance between them. "So talk," she said, her voice hard. "You came all this way. Say whatever it is you came to say. I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. I'm so deeply sorry for what I did. For giving you up. For not being there. For all of it. Sorry." She shook her head. 30 years and you're sorry. I know it's not enough. I know nothing I say can make up for what I did. But it's true. I've thought about you every single day since I signed those papers. Wondered who you were, what your life was like if you were happy. You wondered. Lila's eyes were bright with unshed tears. That's nice. Meanwhile, I grew up with good people who adopted me, who loved me, but I always felt like something was missing. Like there was this hole where my history should be. And when my parents died, my adoptive parents, I had no one. Do you understand that? I had no one. I understand I did that to you. Boone's own eyes burned. I took away your chance to know where you came from, who your mother was, who I was. And I did it because I was a coward. Why? The question came out raw. Why did you give me away? Was I that terrible? That hard to love? No. The word burst from him with fierce intensity. God, no. You were perfect. You were everything good. That was the problem. Lila's expression shifted slightly, confusion mixing with the anger. I was 30 years old, and more broken than you can imagine. Boone continued, the words spilling out now. My own father left when I was 10. I grew up believing I was worthless, that I'd never amount to anything. When your mother got pregnant, I tried. I really did. But I was terrified every minute that I'd fail you the way my father failed me. That I'd damage you somehow. So you left instead. Lila's voice was flat. That makes no sense. It made sense to a scared, stupid young man who convinced himself that you'd be better off with someone else. Anyone else? Boone wiped at his eyes roughly. I told myself I was doing it for you. But the truth is, I was doing it for me. I couldn't handle the fear, so I ran. And I've regretted it every day since. They stood in silence for a long moment, the sound of the mill filling the space between them. Lila's arms slowly uncrossed, and she touched the locket at her throat, an unconscious gesture that spoke of habit and comfort. That locket, Boone said quietly, belonged to my mother. She gave it to Sarah, your mother, right before she died. Said it should stay with you no matter what. Lila's hand closed around the locket. My mom, my adoptive mom, told me it came with me, that it was from my birth, grandmother. Your grandmother loved you without ever meeting you. And your mother, Boone's voice roughened. Sarah never blamed me. Not the way I blame myself. She just wanted what was best for you. How would you know? You weren't there. No, but I knew her. And he pulled Sarah's envelope from his jacket. She left this for you. Before she died. Your adoptive parents had it. I'm guessing you found it when you started searching. Lila's eyes fixed on the envelope, and suddenly she looked much younger, vulnerable. There are letters. Several of them. She wrote about you, about why she agreed to the adoption, about hoping we'd find each other someday. Did you bring them? Would you let me read them? Why should I? But the question lacked the earlier heat. She sounded tired now, worn down by emotion, because I spent 30 years thinking she hated me for what I did. And if there's even a chance she didn't, I need to know. He stopped, gathered himself. I need whatever pieces of her still exist in this world. Just like you do. Something in Lila's expression cracked. A single tear slid down her cheek before she roughly wiped it away. I don't know if I can forgive you. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking for a chance to know you. If you're willing. Lila studied his face for a long time, and Boone forced himself to stand still under her scrutiny, to let her see whatever she needed to see. Finally she spoke. I need time. It's too much, I understand. Do you? Because I've been carrying anger at you my whole life. And now you're standing here real. And it's harder to stay angry when you're not just some idea in my head. Take all the time you need. Boone meant it. I'll be in town. At the boarding house on 3rd Street. Whenever you're ready, if you're ready, you can find me there. Lila nodded slowly, then seemed to make a decision. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. There's a cafe on Main Street. The blue pine, hope flared in Boone's chest. I'll be there. They parted awkwardly, neither sure of the appropriate goodbye. Boone returned to Clementine, his legs shaking from the adrenaline crash. He'd seen her. He'd talked to her. She hadn't slammed the door completely. It was more than he'd had any right to expect. That night at the boarding house, sleep wouldn't come. Tomorrow. He'd see her again tomorrow. The word echoed in his mind like a promise, like a second chance he'd spent 30 years not believing he deserved. Boone arrived at the Blue Pine Cafe 20 minutes early, too anxious to wait at the boarding house. He chose a table near the window where he could see the street, ordered coffee he didn't drink, and watched the clock on the wall move with agonizing slowness. At exactly 2 o'clock, Lila appeared. She walked in carrying a canvas bag, her expression guarded but not hostile. Progress, Boone thought. She sat across from him, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. Two strangers connected by blood and history, and 30 years of absence. "Thank you for coming," Boone said finally. "I didn't sleep last night." Lila set her bag on the floor beside her chair. "Kept thinking about what you said, about being scared, about your father. It's true. All of it." A waitress came by and Lila ordered tea. They waited in silence until it arrived, steam rising from the cup between them. Lila wrapped her hands around it, though the cafe wasn't cold. "Tell me about my mother," she said quietly. "What was she like?" Boone felt his chest tighten. "She was the best person I've ever known. Kind without being weak. Strong without being hard. She saw good in everything, even in me when I couldn't see it in myself." "How did you meet?" "County Fair, summer of 1996. She was 27, working a booth selling preserves. I was 29, working odd ranch jobs. I bought a jar of peach jam I didn't want just to have an excuse to talk to her." A faint smile touched his lips at the memory. "She saw right through me. Called me out on it. But she smiled while she did it and I was lost." "Did you love her?" "Yes, though I didn't know it until it was too late. I was too young, too stupid, too scared to recognize what I had." Boone met Lila's eyes. "She deserved better than me. You both did. She died when I was 3. I don't remember her at all." Lila's voice was soft, almost wondering. "I've seen pictures, but I don't have any memories. Sometimes I think I can almost remember her voice, but I don't know if that's real or just something I made up." She had a laugh that sounded like water over stones, light and clear, and she hummed when she cooked, old songs her grandmother taught her. Boone's voice grew thick. "She loved wildflowers, Indian paintbrush especially. Used to pick them by the armful, fill every jar in the house." "I love wildflowers too," Lila said, something like wonder in her voice. "Indian paintbrush are my favorite. Some things run in the blood, I suppose." They fell into silence again, but it was less awkward now, more contemplative. Lila sipped her tea. Boone finally tried his coffee and found it had gone cold. "The letters," Lila said eventually. "You asked about them yesterday. Only if you want to share them." She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a bundle of envelopes tied with a faded blue ribbon. "There are 5. She wrote them in the months before she died, left them with my adoptive parents with instructions to give them to me when I was old enough to understand." "When did you get them?" "When I turned 18. My parents, the Thorntons, sat me down and gave them to me along with the adoption papers and a few other things. That's when I learned your name. That's when I started wondering about finding you. But you didn't look right away." "No, I was angry. Really angry. I read what she wrote about you, about the adoption, and I hated you for it. I told myself I didn't need to know you, that you'd given up any right to be part of my life." She paused. "Then my parents died. Mom 5 years ago, cancer. Dad last year, his heart. And suddenly I felt so alone. Like I had no roots, no connection to anyone. That's when I started searching." Boone absorbed this, the weight of her loss and loneliness settling on him. "I'm sorry. About your parents. They were good people. They loved me." Lila's voice was firm, protective of their memory. "But they weren't mine by blood. And that mattered more than I thought it would. Can I—" Boone gestured at the letters. "Would you let me read one?" Lila hesitated, then untied the ribbon and selected an envelope from the middle of the stack. "This one talks about you the most." Her hands shook slightly as she handed it over. Boone took it carefully, reverently, and pulled out the folded pages inside. Sarah's handwriting hadn't changed, neat, flowing, confident. He began to read. "My dearest Lila," the letter began. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone, and you'll be old enough to start asking questions about where you came from and who your parents were. I want you to know the truth, even if it's complicated." Boone's vision blurred, but he kept reading. Sarah wrote about their relationship, about the joy she'd felt when she learned she was pregnant, about Boone's fear and struggle. But what struck him most was her lack of anger. "Your father isn't a bad man," Sarah had written. "He's a scared man, and there's a difference. He was damaged by his own childhood, and he couldn't see past that damage to recognize what he was capable of. I wish he could have. I wish he could have seen himself the way I saw him, as someone with so much love to give if he could just get out of his own way." Boone's hands trembled as he read on. Sarah described the decision to place Lila for adoption after she died, explaining that Boone wasn't equipped to raise a child alone, that he'd been drowning in grief and guilt. "I don't blame him for the choice he made," she wrote. "I hope someday you won't either. And I really hope that you and he find each other when the time is right. You deserve to know where you come from, and he deserves to know the beautiful person you'll become." When Boone finished, he couldn't speak. Tears ran freely down his face, and he made no attempt to hide them. Layla watched him, her own eyes wet. "She didn't hate me," Boone finally managed. "All these years, I thought. She understood you better than you understood yourself," Lila said quietly. "She wrote in another letter that you needed time to grow up, to heal. That maybe when that happened, you'd be ready to be the man she always believed you could be. I'm still not sure I'm that man. You rode 3 days to find me. You showed up, even though you knew I might reject you." Lila's voice softened slightly. "That takes courage. Maybe not the courage Sarah hoped you'd find 30 years ago, but courage nonetheless." They sat with that for a while. The cafe buzzed with quiet conversation around them, normal life continuing while their small corner of the world realigned itself. "Can I ask you something?" Lila said. "Anything. Why didn't you try to find me before? In all these years, why didn't you search for me the way I searched for you?" Boone had known this question would come, had prepared for it, but it still hurt to answer. "Because I convinced myself you were better off without me, that I'd only hurt you more if I showed up. I told myself it was selfless, but it was really just more cowardice. I was protecting myself from facing what I'd done. At least you're honest about it. Honesty's about all I got left to offer." Lila studied him for a long moment. "I'm not ready to call you Dad. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that. I understand. But maybe—" She paused, gathering courage. "Maybe we can get to know each other. Start from here and see what happens." Hope bloomed in Boone's chest, fragile but real. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much. I can't promise forgiveness. I can't promise this will work out the way you want. I'm not asking for promises. Just a chance," Lila nodded slowly. "Then let's take it one step at a time." They talked for another hour, carefully at first, then with increasing ease. Layla told him about her life, the Thorntons, her childhood in Santa Fe, her jobs and moves, and the journey that brought her to Canyon Ridge. Boone told her about Redemption Springs, about Clementine, about the simple life he'd built as a kind of penance for his failures. When they finally parted, there was no embrace, no dramatic reconciliation, just a tentative agreement to meet again, to keep talking, to see where this unexpected reunion might lead. It was enough, more than enough. As Boone walked back to the boarding house, he felt lighter than he had in 30 years, as if some portion of the weight he'd been carrying had finally been set down. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Boone stayed in Canyon Ridge, taking odd jobs around town to pay for his boarding house room. Each afternoon at 2 o'clock, he met Lila at the Blue Pine Cafe. They talked about small things at first: weather, work, Clementine's stubborn habits that made Lila laugh. Gradually, they moved to bigger topics: memories, regrets, hopes. Boone learned that Lila was an accountant, good with numbers in a way he'd never been. She'd inherited his mother's stubbornness and Sarah's optimism, a combination that made her both fierce and gentle. He learned that she loved old movies and couldn't carry a tune to save her life, that she preferred coffee in the morning but tea in the afternoon, that she had a temper but rarely showed it, preferring to process things quietly before responding. In turn, Lila learned about Boone's life after the adoption, the years of drinking and self-destruction, then the slow climb back to something resembling stability. She learned about the people of Redemption Springs, about Sheriff Webb and Clara and Tommy Red, about the land he'd inherited from his grandfather, the cabin he'd built with his own hands, the simple peace he'd found in isolation. A week into this careful dance, Lila agreed to introduce Boone to Jack properly. They met at a small restaurant, and the evening was tense but civilized. Jack remained protective, watchful, but he could see that Lila was finding something she needed in these conversations with her father. By the end of the meal, there was a grudging respect, if not quite acceptance. 2 weeks after their first meeting, Lila suggested they meet at the cafe as usual. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where summer still held on, despite autumn creeping in at the edges. She arrived exactly on time as always, but something in her expression made Boone's stomach tighten. They ordered their usual drinks and made small talk, but there was a tension underneath it, like Lila was building up to something. Finally, when the waitress had refilled their cups and moved away, Lila set down her tea and looked at Boone directly. "There's something I need to tell you." The words sent ice through Boone's veins. "What is it?" Lila pulled a folder from her bag, not the canvas one she usually carried, but a professional-looking medical folder. She set it on the table between them, her hands resting on top of it as if to gather strength. "About 6 months ago, I started having symptoms. Fatigue, irregular heartbeat. At first, I thought it was stress from work, from the search for you. But it got worse." Boone's hands gripped the edge of the table. "Well, what kind of worse?" "I went to the doctor. They ran tests." Lila's voice was steady, but Boone could see the fear underneath it. "I have a genetic heart condition. The same one that killed my mother." The world seemed to stop. Boone couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "How bad?" "Progressive. Without treatment, I have maybe 2 to 5 years. She opened the folder, showing him pages of medical terminology he couldn't begin to understand. "There's a surgery that could help. It's risky, but if it works, I could live a normal life." "Then do it." "Have the surgery." The words came out fierce, desperate. "It costs $40,000. Insurance won't cover it because it's considered experimental." "I've been saving, but I'm nowhere close." Boone's mind raced. "How much do you have?" "About 8,000. I've been working extra hours, taking on freelance accounting work. But even if I save everything, it'll take years to get there. And I don't have years." The cruel irony wasn't lost on either of them, finding each other only to face losing each other again. Boone felt like he'd been punched in the chest. "There has to be another way. Payment plans, medical assistance, something. I've applied for everything. I'm on waiting lists. The surgery is tentatively scheduled for 3 months from now, but only if I can pay." Lila's composure cracked slightly. "I've been trying to figure it out on my own. Jack doesn't even know how bad it is. I've been protecting him from it. Why are you telling me?" Boone's voice was rough with emotion. "Because I spent months looking for you, thinking I had time. Now I don't know if I do." Tears welled in her eyes, but didn't fall. "And because if something happens, if I don't make it, I didn't want to leave things unsaid between us. I wanted you to know that I'm glad I found you. Even with everything, I'm glad." Boone reached across the table and took her hand, the first time he'd touched her since that day he'd given her away. Her hand was warm and alive and real, and the thought of losing her was unbearable. "You're not going anywhere," he said with a conviction he didn't entirely feel. "We're going to figure this out. I'll help however I can. I'm not asking for money. I know you don't have that kind of... I don't care what you're asking. You're my daughter. I failed you once. I won't do it again." Lila's tears finally spilled over. "That's the first time you've said it. That I'm your daughter. You've always been my daughter. I just wasn't man enough to act like your father." Boone squeezed her hand gently. "But I'm here now. And we're going to fight this together." They sat there holding hands across the table, years of separation and present crisis binding them in ways that time alone never could. Other patrons glanced over, then politely looked away, sensing something profound and private. Eventually Lila pulled her hand back and wiped her eyes. "I shouldn't have dropped all this on you. It's not fair. Life isn't fair. We both know that better than most. Boone leaned forward. Tell me about the surgery. All the details. Lila walked him through it, the procedure, the risks, the recovery time. The success rate was about 60%, which sounded both promising and terrifying, depending on how you looked at it. If it worked, she'd be fine. If it didn't, she didn't finish that sentence, and Boone didn't ask her to. When's it scheduled? 3 months from today, October 27th. If I can get the money, 3 months. 90 days. It felt like forever, and no time at all. Boone's mind was already working, calculating, planning. He had maybe 3,000 in savings. His truck was worth maybe 2, but his land, the 40 acres his grandfather had left him, that might be worth something. Maybe enough. I need to make a phone call, he said. Back to Redemption Springs. Can we meet tomorrow? Same time? You're not going to do something stupid, are you? I'm going to do whatever it takes. Boone stood up, pulled out enough money to cover their drinks plus a generous tip. Just trust me, please. Lila looked uncertain but nodded. As Boone left the cafe, his mind was already miles away, back in Redemption Springs, thinking about land deeds and property values and what a man's legacy was really worth. That evening, he used the phone at the boarding house to call Sheriff Webb. The conversation was short but illuminating. Webb knew a developer who'd been buying up properties, knew roughly what Boone's land might fetch. The number was close to what he needed. You sure about this, Boone? Webb asked. That land's been in your family 3 generations, and Lila's my family too. 4th generation if you think about it. Boone's voice was steady. Land doesn't mean anything if I lose her now that I've found her. You're a good man, Boone Travers. Better than you give yourself credit for. I'm trying to be. Finally. After he hung up, Boone stood by the window of his room, looking out at the darkening street. Somewhere out there, Lila was going home to Jack, carrying the weight of her diagnosis, still trying to figure out how to save her own life. And here he was, her father, finally given a chance to act like one. The land had been his anchor, his connection to his past, his grandfather's legacy. But Lila was his future, the only one that mattered. The choice wasn't hard. It had never been hard. Some things were worth more than property, more than pride, more than the past. He'd give up everything if it meant she'd live. It was the least he could do, and maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what he needed to do to finally become the father she deserved. Tomorrow, he'd tell her his plan. Tonight, he'd let himself feel the weight of what he was about to sacrifice, and the lightness of knowing it was the right choice. For the first time in 30 years, Boone Travers was going to save his daughter instead of abandoning her. And that felt like redemption. Boone left for Redemption Springs the next morning, riding Clementine through the now familiar terrain with a purpose that drove him faster than the journey to Canyon Ridge. He had 3 months to raise $40,000, and he knew exactly where to start. Sheriff Webb was waiting when Boone arrived, as if he'd known Boone would come straight to him. They sat in the small office that Webb still maintained despite his retirement, and Boone laid out his plan. Sell the land, use his savings, somehow make up the difference. Webb listened without interruption, then leaned back in his chair. That land's worth about 35, maybe 40,000 to the right buyer, Webb said. Harrison Wolf, that developer I mentioned, he's been sniffing around for properties. He'd jump at yours, then set up a meeting. I need the money as fast as possible. Boone, that's your grandfather's land. Your family's legacy. Lila's my family. She's my legacy. Boone's voice was firm. The land is just dirt and memories. She's blood and future. Webb studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You've changed. Finally grew into the man you were supposed to be. Took me long enough. Better late than never. Webb picked up his phone. I'll call Wolf, but Boone, even if you get 40,000 for the land, you're short on time. The paperwork alone could take weeks. Then we make it faster. The meeting with Harrison Wolf happened that afternoon. Wolf was in his 50s, sharp-dressed and sharper-eyed, the kind of man who saw opportunity in other people's desperation. He walked Boone's property with an appraising eye, noting the water access, the view, the development potential. Back in town, in his temporary office above the feed store, he made his offer, 32,000. Cash. I can have it to you in 2 weeks. I need 40, Boone said. And I need it in 10 days, Wolf laughed. That's not how this works. The land's worth what I say it's worth, and I need time for due diligence. The land's been in my family for 70 years. Title's clean. Survey's current. There's nothing to check. Boone leaned forward. 40,000, 10 days. That's my price. Or what? You'll sell to someone else? Wolf shook his head. There is no one else. I'm your only buyer. Boone stood to leave. Then I guess I'll keep it. Wait. Wolf's calculating expression shifted slightly. What's the rush? Why do you need the money so fast? For a moment, Boone considered lying. But the truth was simpler. My daughter needs surgery. Heart condition. She's got 3 months and I've got this land. So that's the trade. Something in Wolf's face changed. Not softness exactly, but recognition of something human and desperate. 35,000, 10 days. That's as high as I go. It wasn't enough, but it was close. Boone nodded and they shook hands. The paperwork would be drawn up by morning. Walking back through Redemption Springs, Boone did the math. 35 from the land, 3 from his savings. 38,000. Still 2,000 short. The gap felt insurmountable, and he had no idea how to close it. He stopped at Clara's store, needing to tell someone, needing advice. Clara listened to the whole story, finding Lila, her condition, the land sale, without interruption. When he finished, she went to her register, pulled out a metal cash box from underneath, and counted out $2,000 in bills. Clara. No. I can't. Yes, you can. She pushed the money across the counter. That girl is Sarah's daughter, and Sarah was dear to me. This town takes care of its own. I don't know when I can pay you back. I don't care if you ever do. Clara's eyes were fierce. Some things are more important than money, Boone Travers. No, take it before I change my mind. Boone took the money with shaking hands. 40,000, he had it. He could save her. Word spread through Redemption Springs, the way news always did in small towns, quickly and without malice. By evening, people started showing up at Boone's cabin. Old Frank Nichols, who owned the largest ranch in the area, handed him $500. For the girl, he said gruffly. Tommy Red from the saloon contributed $200. Others came with smaller amounts, $20 here, $50 there. People who barely knew Boone but remembered Sarah, or who simply believed in helping when help was needed. By nightfall, Boone had an extra $2,000 beyond what he needed. He sat on his porch, overwhelmed by the generosity, by the reminder that he wasn't as alone as he'd always believed. Redemption Springs might be a dying town, but its heart still beat strong. The next morning, Boone called Lila from the general store. I got the money. All of it. Her silence on the other end was so long, he thought the connection had dropped. Then what did you do? I sold my land. The community helped. We got 40,000. Boone, no. You can't sell your family's land for me. I won't let you. It's done. Papers are being drawn up as we speak. The surgery's paid for. I can't accept this. Her voice was thick with tears. It's too much. You're my daughter. There's no such thing as too much. Boone's voice was gentle but firm. Let me do this. Let me finally be your father. Another long silence. Then quietly, thank you. Don't thank me yet. We still got to get you through the surgery. They talked for a few more minutes, making plans. The surgery was still 3 months out, but now it would definitely happen. Lila promised to visit Redemption Springs before then, to meet the people who'd helped save her life, to see where her mother had lived and loved. The weeks that followed were strange for Boone. The land sale went through faster than expected. Wolf was motivated, and the paperwork was indeed clean. Boone signed away 70 years of family history without regret. He watched as surveyors marked his property, as Wolf's plans for development took shape. The cabin where he'd lived for 20 years would be torn down. The stable where Clementine slept, demolished. All of it replaced by vacation homes for wealthy people from the cities. It should have hurt more than it did. But every time Boone felt a pang of loss, he thought about Lila's face, about the surgery that would save her life, and the land seemed less important. Just dirt and timber and memories that would exist whether or not he owned the physical space. 6 weeks before the surgery, Lila made good on her promise to visit. She and Jack drove down on a Friday afternoon, arriving as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Boone met them at the edge of what had been his property, now marked with "Future Site of Mountain Ridge Resort" signs. "I'm sorry," Lila said, seeing the signs. "I'm sorry you lost this." "I didn't lose anything that matters." Boone gestured toward town. "Come on, there are people who want to meet you." The next 2 days were a whirlwind. Sheriff Webb treated Lila like visiting royalty, showing her around town and telling her stories about Sarah. Clara broke down crying when she met Lila, seeing Sarah's features in her grown daughter's face. She gave Lila a quilt she'd made from Sarah's old dresses, fabric saved for 28 years for exactly this purpose. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Clara said, hugging Lila tight. "So very proud." Tommy Red insisted on throwing a small gathering at the saloon. The whole town showed up. Everyone who'd contributed to the surgery fund, everyone who'd known Sarah, everyone who wanted to welcome Sarah's daughter home. Lila was overwhelmed by the warmth, by the sense of belonging she'd been searching for her whole life. "These people don't even know me," she said to Boone at one point. Watching the crowd, "They know you're Sarah's girl, and they know you're mine." That's enough. That evening, Boone took Lila to the small cemetery outside town. Sarah's grave was well tended, surrounded by wildflowers that Boone had planted years ago and maintained ever since. Indian paintbrush bloomed bright red, just as Sarah would have wanted. Lila stood before the headstone, reading the inscription, "Sarah Meadows, 1969-1997, beloved mother, cherished friend. Her light lives on." She knelt down, touched the stone gently, and Boone stepped back to give her privacy. He watched as Lila's shoulders shook with silent tears. As she spoke words he couldn't hear to the mother she'd never known. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and somewhere a bird sang its evening song. Time passed, unhurried and gentle. Finally, Lila stood and returned to Boone's side. "Thank you for taking care of her grave. It's the least I could do." "You've done more than the least." Lila slipped her hand into his, tentatively but deliberately. "You've given me everything." They walked back through town together as dusk settled over Redemption Springs. The next day, Lila and Jack would return to Canyon Ridge. 6 weeks after that, Lila would go into surgery. But in this moment, walking hand in hand through the town where her mother had loved her father, Lila felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she'd found home. Back at the cabin, now rented from Clara's property, smaller but sufficient, they sat on the porch. Clementine dozed in her new stable nearby. The stars emerged one by one overhead. "I'm scared," Lila admitted quietly. "About the surgery? I know." "I am too. What if something goes wrong?" Boone squeezed her hand. "Then we'll face it together. But nothing's going to go wrong. You're strong. You've got your mother's strength and your grandmother's stubbornness. You're going to come through this fine. Promise?" "I promise to be there. No matter what happens, I'll be there." It was the promise he should have made 30 years ago, the promise he'd broken then, but would keep now. As they sat together in the gathering dark, father and daughter reunited against all odds. Boone felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of finally doing right. 6 weeks passed too quickly. Boone closed up the cabin, arranged for Clementine's care with Frank Nichols, and traveled to Albuquerque where the surgery would take place. The hospital was large and modern, a world away from the small-town life he knew. He felt out of place in the sterile corridors, but he didn't care. He was here for Lila, and that was all that mattered. The day before the surgery, Boone met Lila and Jack at the hospital for pre-op appointments. Medical staff explained procedures in terminology that went over Boone's head, but he listened intently anyway, watching Lila's face for signs of fear or doubt. She remained calm throughout, asking practical questions, signing consent forms with steady hands. But Boone could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers worried at the locket around her neck. After the appointments, they checked into a hotel near the hospital. The plan was for all three of them to stay close. Lila needed to be at the hospital by 6 the next morning. They had dinner together at a quiet restaurant, attempting normalcy in the face of tomorrow's uncertainty. Jack tried to keep the conversation light, telling stories about work mishaps and town gossip from Canyon Ridge. Lila smiled at the appropriate moments, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. Boone watched them together. The easy affection between them, the way Jack's hand would find Lila's without thinking, the silent communication of two people who knew each other well. It made him grateful that Lila had found someone who loved her, someone who'd been there in all the years Boone hadn't been. After dinner, Jack excused himself to get some air, leaving Boone and Lila alone in the hotel lobby. They sat in worn armchairs near a window overlooking the parking lot, the fluorescent lights casting everything in flat, unforgiving brightness. "I'm scared," Lila said quietly. It was the first time she'd admitted it so directly. "I know." Boone reached over and took her hand. "I am too. What if I don't make it?" "Don't think like that. But what if?" Her eyes met his, and for a moment she looked very young. "I just found you. I don't want to lose this now." "You're not going to." Boone's voice was fierce. "You're going to come through this surgery, and you're going to have a long, healthy life. You hear me? I want to believe that. Then believe it. You're strong, Lila. You've got your mother's strength, your grandmother's stubbornness, and apparently some of my hard-headedness." A small smile touched his lips. "That's a powerful combination." Lila's answering smile was shaky but real. They sat in silence for a moment, just holding hands, taking comfort in each other's presence. "I have something for you," Boone said finally. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box. Lila looked at it curiously. "What is it?" "Open it." Inside was a simple gold ring, delicate and worn. Lila lifted it carefully, examining the fine engravings along the band. Wildflowers, barely visible but unmistakable. "Your mother had one just like this," Boone said softly. "She wore it every day, even though we never married. After she died, I couldn't bring myself to keep hers, so I had one made identical. Carried it for 30 years. Why? To remember. To remind myself of what I'd lost, what I'd thrown away." He took the ring gently and held it up to the light. "I want you to wear this tomorrow. When you go into that surgery, I want you to know that someone's out here waiting for you to come back." Tears spilled down Lila's cheeks. "Boone, I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you. I know I haven't earned the privilege of being your father in any real sense." His voice was rough with emotion. "But please wear this. Let it be a promise that you'll come back to us, to Jack, to me, to everyone who loves you." Lila held out her hand, and Boone slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. She stared at it through her tears, then looked up at Boone. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For finding me, for saving my life, for being here. There's nowhere else I'd be." They sat together until Jack returned, and then the three of them went to their separate rooms. Boone lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling, silently bargaining with a god he'd never been sure existed. "Take me instead. Let her live, please." Dawn came gray and cold, matching the weight in Boone's chest. In a few hours, Lila would go into surgery. In a few hours, he'd know if he was going to keep his daughter or lose her forever. The waiting was its own kind of torture, but he'd promised to be there. And unlike 30 years ago, this was one promise he'd keep, no matter how hard it was. He dressed, drank terrible hotel coffee, and prepared himself for the longest day of his life. The hospital at 6 in the morning was already bustling with controlled efficiency. Boone and Jack met Lila in the pre-op area, where she wore a thin gown and had an IV already in her arm. She looked small and vulnerable in the hospital bed, but her eyes were clear and determined. "Ready?" the nurse asked, checking the IV line. "As I'll ever be," Lila said, managing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They had a few minutes before she'd be wheeled to surgery. Jack sat on one side of the bed, Boone on the other, both men holding one of Lila's hands. She wore the ring on her right hand, visible even against the white sheets. "I'll see you when I wake up," she asked, looking at Boone. "I'll be right here. I promise." Both of you. Both of us, Jack confirmed, his voice thick. The surgical team arrived. Nurses, an anesthesiologist, the surgeon herself, Dr. Ellen Vance, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands. She explained the procedure one final time, answered Lila's last questions. Then it was time. They wheeled Lila toward the operating rooms. Boone walked alongside the gurney as far as he was allowed, Jack on the other side. At the double doors marked authorized personnel only, they had to stop. Lila reached up, grabbed both their hands. "I love you both," she said. "Love you too," Jack managed. Boone couldn't speak, just squeezed her hand and hoped his eyes communicated everything his voice couldn't. Then she was through the doors, and they were alone in the corridor with nothing to do but wait. The waiting room was designed for this particular kind of misery. Comfortable chairs, magazines no one could concentrate on, a television playing quietly in the corner. Boone and Jack sat side by side, united in their fear and helplessness. "How long did they say?" Jack asked for the third time. 6 to 8 hours, Jack checked his watch. It had been 20 minutes. He stood up, paced to the window, came back. Sat down, stood up again. Boone understood the impulse, but remained seated, hands clasped between his knees, head bowed. On a side table, Boone noticed a worn Bible, the kind that lived in hospital waiting rooms. He picked it up, letting it fall open randomly. The pages revealed Psalms, and his eyes caught on a passage about redemption and mercy. He read it silently over and over, like a prayer or a lifeline. "You religious?" Jack asked, noticing. "Not really. But right now, I'll take whatever help I can get." Jack nodded, understanding. They fell into silence again. Hours crawled by. 8 o'clock came and went. 9, 10. A nurse appeared at noon with an update. "Surgery is progressing well. No complications so far." The relief was temporary, quickly replaced by renewed anxiety. Still hours to go. Still so much that could go wrong. Jack tried to eat lunch from the cafeteria, but couldn't manage more than a few bites. Boone didn't even try. They sat, they paced, they checked the time compulsively. The families came and went, their own dramas playing out in nearby chairs. Life and death, hope and fear, all contained in this one sterile waiting room. At 2 o'clock, another update. Entering the critical phase, whatever that meant. Boone's hands shook as he gripped the arms of his chair. Jack noticed. "She's going to be okay." "You don't know that. I have to believe it." "And so do you." At 4 o'clock, Dr. Vance emerged through the surgical doors. Both men leapt to their feet. The doctor's face was unreadable, exhausted, and for one terrible moment, Boone couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but wait for the words that would either save him or destroy him. The surgery was successful. The relief was so intense, Boone's knees almost gave out. Jack grabbed his shoulder, steadying himself. They both stared at Dr. Vance, afraid to believe what they'd just heard. "We were able to repair the defect completely," Dr. Vance continued, a small smile finally appearing on her tired face. "She came through it beautifully. Recovery will take time, but her prognosis is excellent. She's going to be okay." Jack's voice cracked. "She's going to be just fine." Boone had to sit down. 30 years of guilt and fear and regret seemed to pour out of him all at once, leaving him hollow but light. She was alive. She was going to live. Thank God, thank God. "Can we see her?" Jack asked. "She's in recovery now. Once she's stable and awake, we'll bring you back." Probably another hour or so. When Dr. Vance left, Boone and Jack looked at each other. Jack started laughing, not from humor but from sheer relief, and then he was crying, and then somehow they were hugging. Two men who barely knew each other, bound together by their love for the same woman. "She made it," Jack said, wiping his eyes. "She actually made it." "Yeah," Boone's voice was barely a whisper. "She did." They sat back down to wait for the final call, but this waiting was different. This waiting had hope at the end of it, and life, and everything that mattered. 3 months after the surgery, autumn had fully settled over Redemption Springs. The aspens on the distant mountains glowed gold in the afternoon light, and the air carried that particular crispness that promised winter wasn't far behind. Boone stood on the porch of his small rented cabin, watching the road for the familiar sight of Lila's truck. She'd made a full recovery, better than anyone had dared hope. The doctors were calling it a complete success. Her heart was strong, her energy returned. All traces of the condition that had threatened her life now, just a memory documented in medical files. She'd promised to visit this weekend, her first trip back to Redemption Springs since before the surgery. Boone had cleaned the cabin twice, stocked the small pantry, made sure everything was perfect. Not that Lila cared about such things, but the preparation gave him something to do with his nervous energy. Clementine brayed from her stable, and Boone saw what she'd noticed first. Dust on the road, a vehicle approaching. His heart lifted as he recognized the truck, and by the time it pulled up in front of the cabin, he was already walking down to meet it. Lila climbed out, looking healthier than Boone had ever seen her. Color in her cheeks, brightness in her eyes, an energy to her movements that spoke of life fully restored. Jack emerged from the driver's side, and they both came forward to greet Boone. "You made good time," Boone said, pulling Lila into a hug that felt natural now. No longer tentative or uncertain. "Couldn't wait to get here," Lila said against his shoulder. "I've missed this place." They spent the afternoon visiting everyone, Sheriff Webb, Clara, Tommy Red, all the people who'd contributed to saving Lila's life. Clara cried again, as she seemed to do every time she saw Lila, overwhelmed by the resemblance to Sarah and by the joy of seeing her alive and well. Tommy insisted on buying drinks for everyone at the saloon that evening, a celebration of Lila's recovery and Boone's redemption. But first, there was one place Lila wanted to go. The three of them drove out to the cemetery as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Sarah's grave was as beautiful as ever, the wildflowers Boone tended still blooming despite the cooling weather. Lila knelt beside the headstone, Jack and Boone standing a respectful distance back. "I made it, Mama," Lila said softly to the stone. "The surgery worked. I'm going to be okay." She touched the engraved letters of Sarah's name. "I wish you could have met him. The man he became. I think you'd be proud." Boone felt his throat tighten. He'd spent so many years believing Sarah would hate what he'd become, but her letters had proven otherwise. She'd seen potential in him he'd never seen in himself. After a while, Lila stood and turned to face Boone. "She would forgive you, you know. She already did in those letters. The question was always whether you'd forgive yourself. I'm working on it." Boone's voice was rough. "Having you in my life makes it easier. Good, because you're stuck with me now." They walked back through town as dusk settled, stopping at the site where Boone's land had been. The resort development was already underway. Foundations poured. Framing started on 3 vacation homes. It should have hurt to see his family's legacy transformed into something for wealthy strangers. Instead, Boone felt oddly at peace. "Any regrets?" Lila asked, following his gaze. "Not a single one." He looked at her, healthy and alive. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." That evening, they gathered at Sheriff Webb's ranch. The whole town, it seemed, showed up to celebrate Lila's recovery. There was food and music and laughter, the kind of genuine joy that only comes from a community that truly cares for its own. Lila was pulled from conversation to conversation, embraced and welcomed, told stories about her mother, made to feel like she'd always belonged here. At one point, Boone watched her from across the room, talking with Clara, laughing at something Tommy Red said, one hand unconsciously touching the locket at her throat. Jack stood beside her, protective but relaxed, accepted now by the town as part of Lila's life and therefore part of theirs. Sheriff Webb appeared at Boone's elbow. "You did good, Boone, real good. I just did what I should have done 30 years ago, maybe, but you did it now. That's what matters." Webb raised his glass. "To second chances." "To second chances," Boone echoed, touching his glass to Webb's. Later, as the party wound down and people began heading home, Lila found Boone on the porch looking up at the stars. She stood beside him in comfortable silence. Two people who'd learned to be family to each other despite decades of absence. "Jack asked me to marry him," Lila said finally. "I said yes." Joy bloomed in Boone's chest. "That's wonderful. He's a good man." "He is." She paused. "He asked me to ask you something. He wants to know if you'll walk me down the aisle. We know it's traditional for the bride's father to do it, and..." "Yes," Boone's voice was thick with emotion. "I'd be honored. More honored than you can possibly know." Lila leaned her head against his shoulder. "Who would have thought? 6 months ago, I didn't even know if you existed. Now you're going to give me away at my wedding. I gave you away once before. This time, I'm giving you to someone who deserves you." They stood together as the stars emerged one by one, the night deepening around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Clementine's soft nicker carried from her stable. Redemption Springs settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm. "I'm glad I found that wallet," Lila said quietly. "I'm glad you dropped it where I'd find it. Do you think Mama had something to do with that? Like maybe she was looking out for us?" Boone considered the question. He'd never been much for believing in such things, but the timing of it all, finding the wallet exactly when he did, being in exactly the right place, it was hard to explain by chance alone. "Maybe," he said finally. "Or maybe we both just got lucky after years of being unlucky. Either way, I'm grateful." "Me too." They went inside eventually, where Jack had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from the drive and the celebration. Lila covered him with a blanket, then turned back to Boone. "Thank you," she said. "For everything. For saving my life. For being my father. For just thank you. No need to thank me. You're my daughter. It's what fathers do." The word father no longer felt foreign in his mouth. It felt right, earned, true. That night, after Lila and Jack had gone to bed in the cabin's small guest room, Boone sat alone on the porch one more time. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the moment he found that worn leather wallet to this moment, sitting under the stars with his daughter sleeping safely under his roof. He'd spent 30 years running from his past, believing himself beyond redemption. But the past had come looking for him anyway, in the form of a lost wallet and a daughter who'd been searching for her roots. And in finding each other, they'd both found something they hadn't known they needed: forgiveness, family, and the understanding that some mistakes can be mended if you're willing to try. Boone pulled out the photograph from his wallet, the old tintype of 3-year-old Lila that had started everything. Beside it now was a new photograph, taken just this afternoon. Boone, Lila, Jack, and Clementine, all together, all smiling. Old and new, past and future, loss and redemption. He looked up at the stars, at the vast and indifferent sky that had witnessed all his failures and this one small triumph. "We made it," he whispered to Sarah, to his mother, to whatever was listening. "She's safe. She's happy. We made it." A shooting star streaked across the sky, brief and bright. Boone chose to see it as an answer, as confirmation, as blessing. Then he went inside, locked the door, and went to sleep with a peace he'd never thought he'd feel again. Some mistakes stay with you forever. But some, if you're very lucky and willing to do the hard work, some can be forgiven. Some can even be transformed into something that looks a lot like grace. In a small cabin on the edge of a dying frontier town, a 59-year-old cowboy who'd finally learned what it meant to be a father closed his eyes and dreamed of the future instead of the past. And outside, under the watching stars, Redemption Springs lived up to its name.